Good morning. It is another beautiful early summer Sunday morning. Welcome to this week's edition of the Empathic Ecologist. So today, as I've advertised during the week, I'm going to be talking about trauma recovery. I also mentioned that I'll be talking about kind of a hypothesis of mine, that being spiritual PTSD, and how that connects to religious trauma and recovery from religious trauma. Be discussing the work of Bessel Van Der Kolk in his book, The Body Keeps the Score. And my approach for this episode is, it's more of like a meditation on Van Der Kolk's work than anything else. It's not a formal academic lecture. Not that I'm qualified to give that anyway, but I wish I was an expert in this, and I would like to eventually be an expert. It's one of the reasons why I'm trying to find good books like The Body Keeps the Score and find good resources. Bessel Van Der Kolk's work I have found to be extremely helpful. I'm only 4 chapters into his book, and it's already making a difference in my personal life. So I'm recommending it to you. So think of me as a resource more than anything else. And just my hope in this video is at least it gets you thinking about these topics, and that I can point you to some good resources to check this out for yourself. Because everyone's journey in recovery from trauma is very personal, and I think requires personal attention. I believe a licensed professional therapist or counselor is one of the best qualified humans, if you will, to help guide you through this process. So I recommend seeking one out if you're not already seeing one. If you believe that you have suffered trauma that is affecting you negatively in some way now, that is debilitating you in some way, keeping you from flourishing, if you will, or even from functioning, or in more serious cases, it's making it hard for you to even survive. You know, maybe you're contemplating suicide, maybe you just feel like you're gonna die. I've been there. Not suicide. I have not ever seriously contemplated that myself, so I don't know what that feels like. But I have had times, particularly the year after my mother died, where I felt like, physically, I felt like I was dying. Not that I knew for sure what that felt like, but that's the only metaphor I could use at the time to describe what I was feeling. And grief is tough, you know, and many of us have experienced that. All of us will experience that at some point in our life. Someone we know, someone close to us, even if it's just an animal, you know, but in most people's cases, it's another human, you know, will die, and we will have to deal with grief in some fashion. And there are other forms of grief too. Many who have, you know, left their belief system, their community, their spiritual community, there's a form of grief in that, and it's very real, it's very palpable. And the need for the formation of new community and new connections with other humans who have gone through similar experiences or who are in a healthier place themselves now is really important. So before I go any further, I want to put in a disclaimer. As I mentioned, I am not an expert on this. I'm not a licensed therapist. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a neuroscientist. So take what I say with a grain of salt and investigate this for yourself. As I said, this is just a meditation, if you will, just me sharing my own personal experiences, my own thoughts and musings on this topic. So please don't use it as a diagnostic tool. Just use it as maybe as a window into your own trauma, and take a look in there and get some help, you know, if you haven't already, in trying to figure out what's going on in that house, if you will, and help it to be a healthy and a safe place for you. So with that intro out of the way, I'm going to move on to Bessel Van Der Kolk's work. I'm going to read a quote here. This is from page 55 in his book, The Body Keeps the Score. The heading here is The Brain from Bottom to Top. Bessel says, quote, "The most important job of the brain is to ensure our survival, even under the most miserable conditions. Everything else is secondary. In order to do that, brains need to, number one, generate internal signals that register what our bodies need, such as food, rest, protection, sex, and shelter. Number two, create a map of the world to point us where to go to satisfy those needs. Number three, generate the necessary energy and actions to get us there. Number four, warn us of dangers and opportunities along the way. And number five, adjust our actions based on the requirements of the moment." And since we human beings are mammals, creatures that can only survive and thrive in groups, all of these imperatives require coordination and collaboration. Psychological problems occur when our internal signals don't work, when our maps don't lead us where we need to go, when we are too paralyzed to move, when our actions do not correspond to our needs, or when our relationships break down. Every brain structure that I discuss has a role to play in these essential functions, and as we will see, trauma can interfere with every one of them. Unquote. There's a lot in that one paragraph, and I'm barely going to scratch the surface in this video. I'm trying to keep it to about 30 minutes because I don't want to take too much of your time. As I said, this is just an introduction to this topic. If you're really going to dig into it for yourself, it's going to take a lot of time and energy and years, honestly. I've got a long way to go myself. But I am so thankful for people, groups like the Liturgists, for instance, people like McHargue, Michael Gungor, his wife Lisa Gungor, Dr. Hilary McBride. These are some people that have really helped me to unpack and understand some of my own trauma, what has happened to me. I'm thankful also to my therapist, who I will not name because of confidentiality. But I had my first professional therapist that I saw. I went to this person for over 2 years, and they helped me tremendously. I'm very grateful to them. If they happen to see this, they know who they are. So thank you so much. So, types of trauma. So there's the more obvious types of trauma, like what you might call acute forms of trauma. For instance, let's say, and this is painful. As I said, this is a serious topic, so trigger warnings. I'm going to be talking about some of the specifics of trauma, both physical and spiritual trauma. So if you think you can't handle that, if you don't feel safe, turn this off. I'm not joking. I don't care if you finish it. I want you to be safe. I want you to be healthy. I don't give a shit whether you hear the rest of what I have to say, if it's not going to help you, if it's just going to hurt you, if it's going to trigger you, and, please be careful, okay? So, that being said, a common example would be a young child who is sexually abused by a trusted adult in their life, whether that's a family member, a religious leader, daycare worker, teacher, whoever it might be, a trusted adult, or perhaps a trusted older sibling who has sexually abused them. Particularly if, in the case of a girl, if it's, penetrative sex, if it's rape, that's particularly scarring. As I said, trigger warning, for young boys. Sadly, this happens. There are cases of anal rape. It's heavy stuff, man. And that, forgive my French, but it'll fuck you up. I have, as far as I know, not experienced that myself. I'm pretty confident of that. I've not seen the type of symptoms or the severity of symptoms in my own life that would normally be accompanied by someone who has suffered that. Mike McHargue has shared this publicly, so I don't think he would mind me mentioning this, but he was sexually assaulted, I believe more than once, but at least once as a boy by other boys. He was bullied incessantly. He's on the autism spectrum, so he's already a little different than many other kids who do not have autism. He was often overweight as a child. And I'm not sharing anything that Mike has not shared publicly, so I'm not breaking any confidence there. I encourage you to listen to his story. His book, Finding God in the Waves, which I'll include a link to in the description, is powerful. It was very helpful to me, and it's very painful to hear about what he's gone through. Some of this he's also shared on his own podcast, Ask Science Mike. He has a YouTube channel now, The Cozy Robot Show, which, he deals with mental health issues on there a lot as well, particularly helping the LGBTQ plus community. That's one of his passions, is helping to protect them from harm. Even though he himself is a cisgender straight male, he really has a passion for helping people. He himself was bullied because of who he was. So he hates seeing anyone else bullied because of who they are, because of traits they were born with, or preferences they have, or the way they dress, or anything like that. He hates seeing that happen, with a passion, and he will defend people who have suffered that kind of abuse vehemently. Mike cares about people a lot. So if you see, if you happen to follow him on Twitter and you see him like blasting somebody, know that for Mike, that comes from a very deep place and a genuine concern and love for people, and a hatred for bullying and sexual abuse and any other form of abuse like that. So if you have suffered that, first of all, let me say, I am sorry. I'm sorry that happened to you. That shit sucks. It does. It fucking sucks. Words don't capture the level of pain that results from that kind of trauma. That it really doesn't. And me, even though, it stirs my empathy, my empathetic response, I haven't been there. I don't know I can only imagine. I can only guess at what that feels like. So if you have been through that, I'm so sorry that has happened to you. So there's those types of trauma, more acute forms. Obviously, PTSD, like in its early stages of research and development, came out of, but in part, Bessel Van Der Kolk's work with veterans, combat veterans in particular, people who had seen friends die in front of them in combat, who had killed other humans in combat. There's a lot to unpack there. And as he talks about in his book, in so many ways, your body is stuck back in there. And if I'm understanding his work correctly, again, I'm not an expert, but based on what I know up to this point, I think it is your limbic system, what you might call the mammalian brain, and then your, reptilian brain, the lower brain. As I understand it, I think those are the parts of your brain, and then along with that, your nervous system that gets stuck in the past in that traumatic event. And there could be like a sight, a scent, a sound that triggers your limbic system's memory, your body's memory of that traumatic event, and it can cause you to almost relive that. It's like you're transported back there to that event, and you're there in that moment, even though it may have happened years ago. And it's very hard for people who have suffered those types of trauma to move on from that. It takes a lot of therapy, and honestly, as Bessel Van Der Kolk talks about, scientists, therapists, counselors are still learning how to treat those those disorders, those how to treat that trauma, how to help people to recover from that. So it's a work in progress. And one of the things I think is really important in helping them to learn how to help others, as well as to, is for those of us who have experienced trauma, no matter what form, when we feel safe doing so, to share our stories. Those of us who are in a healthier place, who feel safe sharing, and it doesn't have to be out in public like I'm doing here. Find a small group, maybe a support group where you can share it in a much safer environment, a confidential environment. That's how I started. I've been in groups like that for years, just of different forms. So trust me when I say my journey to coming to this point where I'm ready to talk about it publicly took me a long time. So I did not jump into this, and people who suffer more acute forms of trauma than I have, let's put it this way. You are not obligated. You are not obligated. Hear what I say. If you're a victim of abuse, you are not obligated to help other victims. Now, if you feel you have the capacity to do so and you want to do so, then by all means do it. If you feel safe doing so, you want to do that, do it. But you are not obligated to. You need to heal first. You need to heal. That's really important. Speaking only for myself, and I think for other people, I could probably speak for other people who care about you as well. We want you to survive. We want you to survive. So take care of yourself first. Don't put shame on yourself. Don't feel that you are obligated to help other people who have suffered that. I know you will probably want to, you may want to, but if you can't do so safely and in a healthy way for yourself, please be cautious about that. There are other people who maybe are further along in the healing process, or others who are qualified to help those individuals. They're in a healthier, safer place, or perhaps a more educated space, whatever that is that can help them. So get healthy yourself. That's my encouragement to you. So those are those severe types of trauma. Obviously, grief. This is more personal to my story, and I think to most people, have lost someone at some point. By the time you get into your late 30s, like me, at some point, someone you know and care about has died. For me, as I've shared many times before, it was my mother. She died when I was 17 after a 5-year battle with cancer. So for me, my brain was still developing at that point. I was still a teenager. So my higher brain, my rational brain, if you will, as well as my limbic system. I'm still learning about this, as I've said, but my brain, the brain as I understand it, for your average human male, in many ways is continuing to develop up until at least age 25. At that point, many patterns are set in place. Now, some can be changed. There is what we call neuroplasticity. So I'm living proof that you can find healthier patterns. You can start to rewire your brain so that you can function in a healthier way. But many patterns that you will carry with you for the rest of your life. I don't say this fatalistically, but just biologically speaking, a lot of those, as I understand it, start to get kind of set in place by the time you reach your mid-20s. But when you're, 13, 14, 15, 17-year-old, like I was when my mom was going through cancer, that had an inexorable impact on my my brain and my body. And I still carry a lot of that with me. Same for my sisters, who were even younger than I was at that time. So that takes a long time, and you never really fully recover from it. It's when you have loss at an early age, whatever that loss might be, it kind of lives with you really for the rest of your life. And again, I don't say that to be fatalistic. I don't say that, oh, you're cursed. It's like, no, it's something to learn about yourself, to learn, as I've been learning, how that affects my day-to-day life, how I still carry that trauma with me. So there's that. I've talked about that elsewhere. So today, in my final 10 minutes, I want to talk a little bit about spiritual PTSD. So I've thought about attacking this from a couple different angles. One way I was thinking of was reading Romans 7 through 8. For those of you who are Christians, who are familiar with the Bible, you may be familiar with this passage. It's where the Apostle Paul, I'll just read one quick verse just to give you a snippet of that. So I've been thinking about that this weekend. It came to mind as I was reading Bessel Van Der Kolk's book. So this is Romans 7, verse 21. By the way, this is the Oxford Study Bible translation. So Paul says, I discover this principle then, that when I want to do right, only wrong is within my reach. In my inmost self, I delight in the law of God, but I perceive in my outward actions a different law, fighting against the law that my mind approves, and making me a prisoner under the law of sin which controls my conduct. Wretched creature that I am, who is there to rescue me from this state of death? And he fleshes out that concept more, obviously, in the preceding verses and the following verses, the idea of this battle between the spirit and the flesh, between what his mind wants to do and what his body wants to do. And what made me think of that is Bessel talking about the difference between what you call the higher brain or the rational brain and the emotional brain, which is the limbic system as well as the reptilian brain. And I'm struggling to find all the words here. This is a really dense chapter. I'll just read a real quick quote here from him. The emotional brain's cellular organization and biochemistry are simpler than those of the neocortex or our rational brain, and it assesses incoming information in a more global way, it being the emotional brain. So that's basically your neocortex is your rational brain, and everything else below that is what he refers to as the emotional brain. So that handles like your autonomic functions, like your breathing, your heart beating, your circulation, stuff like that, as well as like much of your emotional life. It seeks to protect you. When your body perceives a threat, your limbic system will kick in to high gear and trigger like a fight or a flight response, or perhaps a shutdown response in some cases where you like play dead, if you will. I've talked about this in other videos. Anyway, as he says, as a result, the emotional brain jumps to conclusions based on rough similarities, in contrast with the rational brain, which is organized to sort through a complex set of options. The emotional brain initiates pre-programmed escape plans like the fight or flight responses. These muscular and physiological reactions are automatic, set in motion without any thought or planning on our part, leaving our conscious, rational capacities to catch up later, often well after the threat is over. So basically, if your body perceives a threat, something that is preventing you from your body from getting what it needs, like food, rest, protection, sex, shelter, etc. If there's something that is preventing that, then your emotional brain, if you will, reacts and takes action, often even before your rational brain is aware of it. And then sometimes while it's going on, you might already be running away from a threat, like literally physically running away from a threat, and then your higher brain, your rational brain is like, oh, why am I running? Oh, I'm running because I saw a bear. Oh shit, there's a bear behind me, whatever. So in thinking about Paul's words, like the struggle between the spirit and the flesh, I think, this is just my hypothesis, call it a working theory if you will, I think what Paul is describing there is the tension between the rational brain and the emotional brain. The rational brain, in Paul's case, being the part of his brain that knew, had memorized the Torah, that knew the law, that knew the Mosaic law. He knew it backwards and forwards. I've heard some people say that he had the equivalent of a couple PhDs worth of education in the law, the writings, and the prophets, like the Jewish Bible, if you will. He had like a PhD in that, like he was an expert. So his rational brain was very familiar with the law and what, in his religion, what he believed his God wanted him to do. But there are times where those commands, I think, this is just my thinking on it, would get in the way of what his emotional brain wants. Like his emotional brain is like trying to make sure his body has everything it needs. Like your emotional brain is telling your body, I need food. But if his rational brain is saying, I need to fast in obedience to the law for however long this period is, the emotional brain is going to be fighting against that, because the emotional brain is trying to make sure your body has the nutrients it needs to continue functioning, that you need food and water, right? But if your rational brain, is really convinced that you need to do this, there's going to be a tension there. There's going to be a fight there between those two. And I think, I personally think that's like the spirit and the flesh. And I will admit this is coming from a more naturalistic perspective. I don't consider it pure materialism. I'm more of a naturalist in that I think it is possible that there are like extra dimensional entities that exist and that interact with this universe. There's so much that we don't know about it. One of those beings could be God, or could be the creator. There could be other entities as well that seek to frustrate that being's purposes or our purposes, or just after their own purposes, whatever. That's possible. But kind of where I'm living now is I'm open to that, but I want to see evidence. So for now, I'm kind of going with what we do know, what we can reasonably observe and conclude. And we've been able to study the brain. We know a heck of a lot more about it now than humans did when Paul was writing that, like almost 2,000 years ago. We know a lot more about the brain and the body and how they function. So much of what was mysterious back then, spiritual, numinous, if you will, we now understand, through repeated observation, through very careful observation, using our imaging tools, like MRIs and CAT scans and like being able to monitor like neurotransmission, things like that. So much goes into that. It's amazing how much we've learned and how much there is yet still to learn. But as I said, my working theory is that Paul is describing the tension between the rational brain and the emotional brain, between the neocortex and the limbic system. Your limbic system is just trying to help your body survive. So if, wherever that story came from, whether it was told to you in your religion, whether it was told to you in school, by your parents, television, a movie, I don't care where you got it from. If it's conflicting with your emotional brain, there's going to be tension there. There's going to be like a war going on. And I think that war can be a source of trauma. Particularly if you have a theology, if you have a worldview that says the flesh, this corporeal body, though I think more precisely like the flesh is more like the emotional brain. It's like this mysterious, what they saw as a spiritual force within you, but now we know is probably physiological. It's literal biological part of your body, says that's bad, or at the very least that has been corrupted by sin. It's bad. There are times where it's going to lead you to do things that are morally wrong, and or to disobey God, if you will. So you gotta, the general, if you will, the neocortex, the rational brain needs to step in and say, no, I'm going to obey these laws. I'm going to do what I know up here is right. But your emotional brain is saying, hey, my priority is to keep this body alive, to keep it healthy, to keep it functioning, to survive. That's my priority. So you have that tension there. from a psychological standpoint, this is one of the reasons why I no longer identify as a Christian, because I think modern science has a better understanding of this than humans who lived 2,000 to 3,000 years ago do. I mean, that's just common sense. And I think if the book had been overseen and in a way that it's supposed to be perfect, like by the creator of the universe, it doesn't make sense that there would have been information in there that would harm people now, if the intent was that this is the one-time revelation that I'm delivering to humans and it's supposed to apply for the rest of their lives. You know what I'm saying? Like, not, at least not in the sense that I was raised to believe, kind of the somewhat reductionist fundamentalist sense, which in many ways was a reaction to scientific developments. I've talked about that elsewhere. I'm not going to go into detail about it. But I was taught essentially that this book contains everything I need to know, everything that's of importance that I need to know for life and practice, for the functioning of me, the organism Richard, if you will. And as I've said, I've tried to live it out for over 30 years, and I'm finding that not to be true. At least not in the sense that I was raised and taught growing up. And as I've said before, I'm not sharing this to bash my teachers, to disparage them. I'm just examining the system, as I think everybody does, especially when you get into your 30s and you start having, if you already have kids, you reach your midpoint of your life. It's just natural part of human growth to really re-examine what you were taught and what you were raised with. That's just normal. So I'm not saying it to bash any particular human or individual. I'm just trying to understand it as best I can. Anyway, I'm rambling. Not that I'm... Anyway, yeah. So trauma, spiritual trauma. So that being told that your emotional brain that's trying to keep you alive is bad and that it's fighting against God himself, that I can see where, and I sensed this at times in myself, where I felt like I was experiencing symptoms that are similar to bipolar disorder, where there's like intense swings, there's like this division, this dissociation. I think he talks about that in this book as well, a dissociation between my rational brain and my emotional brain. As I'm told, essentially the rational brain, the part of me, biologically speaking, that can read books, and interpret language and remember it, that can read these things. What it knows, can be in tension with what's below. But I'm told that, So yeah. Anyway, that's one form. Another thought that I had as I've thought about this idea of spiritual PTSD is in religious systems that focus more on apocalypticism, which, as I understand it, was something that was fairly popular, fairly widespread in Jesus' day, in the century or two leading up to Jesus' day. Apocalypticism was a growing movement, I guess, within the Jewish community. It's kind of this focus on the end times, the end of the age, the end of the world, what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, what God's going to do at the end of time. These ideas of like that he is going to judge the living and the dead at the end. He's going to come and eventually wipe out all the evil humans, all the wicked humans. He's going to wipe them out, and he's going to take only the righteous into paradise, into eternity, if you will. But in my tradition, that was talked about a lot, like apocalypticism, the end of the world, Jesus coming back. Now, it was it was framed both negatively and positively. The negative side of it was humanity's getting worse, human society is getting worse, is getting more and more evil, more and more violent, more and more corrupt, and that will continue on and on. And a lot of this is based on things that the Apostle Paul either wrote or allegedly wrote. I'm thinking of some verses in 1st and 2nd Timothy that talk about what the world's going to be like, at that time. You got the book of Revelation, you have like things like Mark 13 and 14, where Jesus talks about some of the, the apocalyptic events that are to come. You see a lot of it scattered throughout some of the Old Testament prophecy. So, but this was emphasized a lot. My tradition, as I understand it, it's emphasized a lot in most American evangelical churches. So it's like the world's getting worse, everything's getting worse, it's going to get worse and worse and more evil, people are going to get worse and worse, and then Jesus will come back and finally fix it all. So it shifts the way you're looking at the world. Rather than having hope that things can change or grow or get better, you believe that it's going to get worse and worse and worse until Jesus comes back, which none of us know when that is for sure, So you're always looking for that, trying to predict it, trying to look for the signs that he gave, while at the same time looking at the world as it's going to keep getting worse. So you tend, if you go into the news or things expecting to see that, you typically find what you expect to see, which isn't hard, with modern media. But if you're in that mindset all the time, and then you throw into that also the ideas of spiritual warfare, the idea that Satan, is in opposition to God and in opposition to God's people, and that he's waiting around every corner like a lion, wanting to devour you, eat you alive, basically. But you can't, so you got these threats. And then on top of that, like, that if you ever walk away from God, and reject him, that God will destroy you. So that's a threat on that side. Then you've got Satan over here. You're being told he wants to destroy you, so that's a threat on that side. But you can't see these threats. They're invisible. So your rational brain, that's it's been taught, and I think, particularly in more emotional sermons, like where the pastors, the preachers are getting really worked up and they're emotional, like that will register more. Or if you happen to see Christian films like Thief in the Night, shout out to my fellow evangelicals who have seen that, or even the Left Behind series, like can register some of that in your limbic system as well. So like you're on the alert and you're like looking around for threats, but there's all the sensory input that would normally come when a legitimate physical threat is there is nowhere to be seen, because all of this is invisible. It's happening in the abstract. You're told it's real, but you can't, none of your other senses are so. But imagine, like, you're on the alert all the time. You're told to be on the alert all the time. You imagine how stressful that is. And my theory, again, just a working theory, a hypothesis that I'm studying, testing, thinking about, is that for me, and I think for many other people who have left Christianity, or who at least have left evangelicalism and have moved into what for them is a healthier version of Christianity, that was a form of trauma that traumatized them, especially if you were taught as a little kid about some of these things, and you're hearing it all the time as a little kid, especially between ages 0 and 5, when your brain is really going through a lot of development, a tremendous amount of development. Like if you're taught the concept of hell at that age, or similar things about the judgment of God, or Satan, or, demons, etc. That stuff lodges in there, and it's deep. And I've heard people that have been atheists for 20, 30 years that are still struggle with the fear of hell, even though they've left behind many of their other fears. Like that one sticks in there, especially if you're taught it as a little kid, and that's just because of the way the brain works. Particularly if you grew up in, like, which I was fortunate not to. But if you grew up in churches where you had like your quote unquote hellfire and brimstone preacher, where he's always emotional, always angry, like this angry white man yelling at you about hell and the threat of hell and you better repent and etc. Again, I was fortunate not to grow up in churches with pastors like that. They were more emotionally mature, the pastors I had. I'm very thankful for that. But the teachings were still there. The concepts were still there. Even though the pastors, I think, were more reasonable and empathetic in their approach and in their teaching of these concepts, the concepts were still there, and we were encouraged to believe them, So I've still experienced some trauma from that, though not as much as others have. So that's a lot. Spiritual PTSD. As I said, I'm still pondering this, still thinking about the physiological effects. I think for me, it's hard. It's still a bit. I have to be in the right mindset. I almost have to approach it only from with my rational brain. To be safe, I almost have to approach it rationally and more academically, like reading this book, just to feel safe. Just to feel safe. Because if I try to come into it empathetically, I try to connect with it emotionally, it can very quickly trigger my traumatic responses. It can cause me to relive some of that trauma, and then it triggers my fight or flight response, and or my shutdown. Either fight, or I want to fight. I get angry, like really angry, or I want to run away. I'll escape to entertainment, fiction, addictive behaviors, or physically, like literally physically get up and want to leave and get out from where I'm at and go somewhere, or my shutdown response, and that's connected to my history of depression, so my body just starts to shut down. So I have to be really careful how I approach that, and the more stories I've heard, people who left, particularly those who left even more high control environments than I was in, where not just your ideology was controlled, but your behavior as well. Like literally other people were, placing tremendous restrictions on behavior. People who came out of what we would more commonly call a cult or a cultic environment have a lot deeper trauma than I do. So we have to be really careful in how we approach that. So I say this to Christians who have had a loved one who has left the faith, and you're concerned about them. And I understand. I really do. Like, if you genuinely believe that they may be headed to hell because of where they're at, I get it. You love them, you care about them, you don't want to see them suffer. But just be mindful of that. If they have experienced the type of trauma that I have been talking about for the last 10 minutes or so, it may be very hard and very triggering for them to have conversations about that. So just be mindful of that if you try to engage with them in that. I'm not saying those conversations don't need to be had at some point, but just be mindful of that, and be careful and cautious, when you engage with them. Be mindful of their emotional state. Look for physiological symptoms that you might see that maybe they're getting triggered, maybe they're reliving some trauma. Read this book. Learn to notice those. And you may learn some things about yourself, and your own trauma, whatever that might be, whether it's physical or acute trauma or abuse, physical abuse, whatever it might be that you yourself have suffered, grief, physical illness. There's many different types, many different situations. There are some situations and events that can traumatize one person and not traumatize another. So it's all very complicated. And I'm going long, so I need to wrap up here. So this is going to have to be more than one part. My title was going to be Trauma Recovery, but I realized I didn't really get into talking about recovery. But how this connects to that, though, is the first step in recovering is that you have to recognize the trauma that you're experiencing. You have to recognize it for what it is. Begin to understand what has happened to you, what you've gone through, how your body is processing it. Understand those signs, those symptoms. That's like the first step. And then if you haven't already, reach out for help. Get help from a licensed professional counselor or therapist, a trusted friend or confidant, someone who's safe, Doesn't have to be a therapist right away, but just someone who's safe, someone who you feel safe with, someone you trust to keep your confidence, who genuinely cares about you. Reach out. Please ask for help if you haven't already. And if you have, continue to do so. Working through this shit, there's no set schedule, for it. It's a journey, and everyone's journey is unique. There's not like a nice tidy to reference another organization. And I know they don't look at it this way, but just to use as an example, there's not a nice tidy 12 steps that you can follow to recovery. Now, that being said, things like that can be guideposts. They can be like a guide to help you in that process. But at the end of the day, your journey is your own. Your journey is unique. My journey is unique. So my encouragement is, let's not shame ourselves. Let's not shame others, who are going through their own journey. Be patient, be empathetic, be kind to them. Be willing to listen. In particular, be willing to listen. Ask thoughtful questions when it's appropriate. But more than anything, just be there for them. Just be there for them. Just be with them. Ask them what they need from you. And be there. Just be there. Be present. And hang out. So, resources. Obviously, this book. And I posted about this on Instagram, but I found this on Amazon. I didn't know there was one. There is a workbook, and I just started using it. And like with chapter 4, basically it gives a summary of the chapter. Then it asks you some questions. It gives you some exercises to help you work through this and process the book and how it relates to your own trauma recovery journey. I mentioned Mike McHargue, his book Finding God in the Waves. He has a new one that he's come out with called You're a Miracle, parentheses, and a pain in the ass. And he talks about some of what I've discussed here, like that tension, that fight between the rational brain, the emotional brain. Why can't we do what we want to do? Like I want to lose weight, but I keep eating, etc. Things like that. He talks a little, I encourage you to get the audiobook if you can. But either way, so shout out for Mike. Dr. Hilary McBride is an excellent resource. She has a book that I've got that I want to read so I can better understand how to help my wife and my daughters. It's called Mothers, Daughters, and Body Image by Dr. Hilary McBride. I can't 100% recommend it based on the book itself because I've not read it yet, but Dr. Hilary McBride is someone whose advice I trust. She was a regular guest on the Liturgists podcast for many years, so I've heard a lot of what she has to share and say. She's an excellent resource as well. I found this group through Instagram, actually. It's called I Got Out, igotout.org. And what I see a lot of former Jehovah's Witnesses who are connected to that group, who got out of that cult. There are others, but it's just a general organization to help people who are cult survivors, if you will. So igotout.org. I believe they're on Instagram at igotout. I'll put links in the description and stuff. And recovering from religion, if you're looking, if you're in a place where you feel safer with a more humanist or atheistic organization, you want to get as far from religion as you can. Recovering from religion is an excellent resource there. And even if you're not quite in that spot, they try to be welcoming and inclusive to wherever you are on the spectrum. If you're recovering from an unhealthy religion, even if you're not, I don't consider myself an atheist in the common sense of the word, but I have received a lot of help from them, and they're very science oriented in their approach, but they also are trying to create a community of support as well. So recovering from religion, I believe, is rfr.org. And then obviously local therapists. And if you can't find someone local, look up online options. I've used BetterHelp for the last few months and have found it helpful. I am going to transition back to an in-person therapist, but I live in an urban area where I have access to quite a few. But if you don't, or if you can't find one that meets your needs, BetterHelp can be a good resource. I believe there's another new organization called, I think it's Talkspace. Both of them are on Instagram. So you have So check them out, or if you just prefer, online. They also have, you can do a phone call, you can do texts, you can do, like a video conference session, that's flexible. So they're a good resource as well, and recommended by many people that I also like. And last but not least, like, comment, or subscribe to my channel. And feel free to contact me. If you look at, like, I have links to my Instagram, my blog, and my Twitter accounts on my YouTube channel. So you can find it through one of those. If you go to my Instagram account, I'm a lot more active on there. And there's a link tree there where if you go to that site, you can email me from that. I have an email that's dedicated to this channel. And so it's just for community within this channel. Also, feel free to comment. If you hit me up on Instagram, you can send me a direct message. I can't promise I'll always be able to respond promptly, but I'll respond as quickly as I can. And yeah, hit me up. And anyway, thank you for watching. Sorry this got a little long, but I hope it's helpful. So with that, I want to finish and say peace to you, my fellow humans. Stay curious and be healthy.